Sometimes you'll be surprised that these fun explorations or newness that you try to bring as the creative distinctiveness might determine the next evolution in the business.
Welcome to Stuck in Design, where our founders share candid conversations about design, creativity, and business. Let's begin.
When we're outside of the creative industry, how do you bring creativity into another job that may come across as, a little bit more unchanging, more repetitive, like numbers crunching and things like that? How do we bring creativity into it?
Well, the first challenge is to think of whether there is such a thing as a non-creative industry, right? I think human beings being in any of the fields that you can work in have a potential to bring some newness to things, even if it's a very regimented, repetitive type of industry. Well, I would say the first, if we go back to the example we gave earlier on, like the water bottle, I think in any kind of regular, repetitive practice, you are still usually dealing with people, some level of communication, right? And some task at hand. You could start from there to say that, like, hey, instead of always seeing my work as this function to fulfill this mechanical task, I realized that, like, there are people involved in this, and what resonates with people, let's make a list, right? People like food, people like fun, people like friendship, right? People like a sense of recognition, belonging. Now, if you take any of these elements just as part of a long list alone and put it into your context of work to say, hey, can we do this such that maybe colleague A and colleague B would find a bit more collaboration in the steps that they take to achieve the task, so that then at least they form a friendship, right? Or maybe they just find it more satisfying doing it with someone else. Now, there are also other things that can be brought into the picture to say, if we've never considered solving the problem with food, right? Because how do we solve an accounting issue with food, right? And nobody really thinks along that line. But the moment that you start to say, let's consider this possibility, then maybe some kind of way to get people who do not file their receipts well in a team can be done over kind of a monthly makan session. Sit down, have a cup of coffee, everybody. Now these 2 hours, food is sponsored, file your receipts during these 2 hours. There is sometimes ways to use a different method that relates better to people than let's just look at our Excel sheet, let's implement another rule, let's send out another complaining email to get people to do things. There are many more inspiration sources possible. Okay, so really speaking off the cuff here, so some of this may sound rather unformed, but that hopefully gives you a sense of how, in every place there can be some difference brought if you bring some alternative type of thinking to the way things are solved. Yeah.
So when you were talking about how to apply sort of creative means to a more regimented workflow, I was actually thinking about what would even trigger someone to want to change the status quo in a creative manner. Yeah, because sometimes I guess when things are working, and even though they may be tedious or not as fun to do, if they work, then people might question like, why do we need to change?
There sometimes isn't a need for change, right? And I think depending on the person, some people are, in our experience, really reliable because they are unchanging, right? And you know that everything that they do is very predictable. So that gives you a certain sense of certainty when you work with them. Like you put A in, B comes out, for example, right? Now, I suspect that for many others, their strength and talent is not in feeling a passion for work that is like that. right? That, I think many people would rather have a bit more variety, maybe because I suppose that most of us are, as human beings, made to be somewhat creative, right? At least improving things. So I think that what might be impetus for status quo shifting could just be that you do something a little bit more interesting. Your work is a bit more fun, right? You bring some newness, and sometimes you'll be surprised that these fun explorations or newness that you try to bring as the creative distinctiveness might determine the next evolution in the business, right? Because new solutions come out that like, hey, others haven't really tried, and that whole industry evolves. So there's both a very practical side to it for evolving and improving things. There's a very strong survival side to creativity. And then, of course, there's the other thing about just expressing fully who you are. Like, do you want to just do your job, right? Or do you want to do it in a way that you bring yourself to it, right? All your differences, your uniqueness to it. I think, one cannot really force everyone to have this type of willingness to shake the status quo. And I think there are places for people who shake it a little but very reliably to always do incremental improvements. I think that's very important too. And there are others, maybe a bit more like us, our kind of wiring is to shake it very big, to find the next transformation. That's just how we are with our type of wiring. And then we need all of these elements in place, that incremental improvements. And I think, I suspect that having that very steady, reliable, constant is also a type of skill set and a place to play, right? To have things run well. So, if you ask me, I'm biased. I would say that like, hey, let's always change the, status quo.
Our podcast usually ends here, but we have a follow-up question from Kevin, who's on the podcast team.
It's more of an opinion thing. Like, how valuable do you think all these 3-month design courses for leadership and C-suite are in implementing change in the company? Since you can't really exercise it super well unless you train it up like a good muscle, and with this short time span, it's kind of a small dip into stuff. Is it really worthwhile?
Well, maybe one question to ask you is, would you like your boss to be more creative with the way he handles and shapes your employment? Right? That's one, right?
Yeah.
And if he's not, right, because he, like what you're supposing here, can't get trained and equipped well enough in like a short session to be creative enough, are you at least kind of hopeful that he will be open to it and get exposed to it? Perhaps such that he might get someone who is trained to do it, or he might be open to how you suggest, right, a different way. I mean, these are valuable change, right?
The underlying concern or the underlying thing under is just that when you find yourself unable to train an entire department, it becomes a very uphill battle to implement. So that's why I think that's partly where it comes from. Because I mean, you always need your boss to be on board with your idea. Then after that, you need your boss to train everyone else with his own like limited design experience. Then that becomes like a very big uphill battle. Yeah.
You see, one is solving the creative challenge of the task itself, right? And then you have a creative solution. You might need to be creative with how you get the solution to be bought in, right? So there is a using of creativity for that purpose too. And sometimes it is about not calling it design, right? Because what is design is just really intending, right, a certain type of way of operating, right? So if you sometimes don't call it design in an organization, say, hey, I have a good idea to solve this problem, right, or to improve this thing, or I have some good idea to save your cost every month, or I have some good idea to make our teammates a lot happier, right? You don't mention creativity, you don't mention design, maybe it gets a bit more traction. Then the moment you say, hey, I went to this design thinking course, right, we should change this, then you'll be like, suspicious about this design thinking thing again, yeah, so at the heart of things, creativity is both like finding a new way at the same time finding a way that resonates with people. So you have to find both, right? And implementation challenges usually are about finding a way that can resonate with people.
Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week to get stuck in design.